Are you a fan of the Dreamcast controller? Because it is divisive.
I actually like it. People complain about the Duke, which was the original launch Xbox controller.
Yes, as a proud Duke owner, yes.
Yeah.
Somebody in my family, a cousin, owned a Sega Saturn. Only person I knew who ever owned one. Went over to his house, saw Nights into Dreams one time, thought, that's pretty cool, and then never thought about the Saturn again.
Thank you, Sega, for delivering this and, giving this, even if it wasn't appreciated at the time. Hey, and welcome to Power Up, presented by Razer. I'm Sam Stone, and this week we're going to be talking about Fatal Fury, including the new Fatal Fury game coming out next year, and we're going to talk about our favorite Sega console, the Dreamcast. So sit back, plug in, and power up. I love Fatal Fury, and we haven't had a new game in the franchise since 1999 with Fatal Fury for the Sega Dreamcast. Well, I gotta go to Summer Game Fest and play the upcoming Fatal Fury City of the Wolves, the first Fatal Fury game since 1999, and talk to the people that helped make it. So let's go ahead and run that tape. We are having the art director and the director of Fatal Fury sign my copy of Fatal Fury Mark of the Wolves that I've had since like 2001. Arigato gozaimasu, gentlemen, for signing this for me. Here we are at SNK. We just played Fatal Fury City of the Wolves. It's the first Fatal Fury game in over 25 years, and it's great. There's two different play styles. You've got the Rev system, all your favorite characters, along with some new faces are along the way. Here I am with some of the creators behind the game. With Fatal Fury, there had been work done on a sequel to Mark of the Wolves. How was it kind of like taking the production in this direction for what we now know as City of the Wolves?
We kind of had to restart things and a lot of different reasons and such, but we were still looking back at some of the stuff we wanted to do back then whenever we had Mark of the Wolves 2 sequel. We did as much as we could to basically take some of those ideas, but then also kind of arrange them and match them up with more modern trends, basically. But in the end, I think we were able to complete and basically do exactly what we wanted to on the original game.
One of the things that really surprised me with this is the Rev system, which is kind of this new gameplay mechanic. What did you want to add to the classic Fatal Fury style through the Rev system?
From the visual standpoint, the Rev system, one thing that they wanted to make sure was that it was very easy for new players to jump in and do some very cool and appealing and kind of exciting looking combos, and stuff like the blue silhouette that you leave behind and stuff is there to give them a very almost direct sense of accomplishment when they're able to pull off these feats in the game.
One of the cool things is the past several years, we've seen New Samurai Showdown, we've seen KOF 15. How did you want Fatal Fury to kind of be part of this renaissance for SNK, but stand and stay true to the classic Fatal Fury at the same time?
For him, Fatal Fury is just one of the most iconic SNK IPs out there. Especially, I think you would say, with Mark of the Wolves, a lot of people were left on cliffhangers, especially Rock stories left on a completely, open cliffhanger. So being able to go and try to finish that story was especially pleasing for him.
You've got all these fans like myself that have played the classic game on Dreamcast from 25 years ago. How is it balancing rewarding longtime fans and also making it accessible for new fans?
Yeah, especially for the veterans, I think, as we were saying before, a lot of the stories haven't been completed for these characters. And to be able to, Fatal Fury is very unique in that there is a very distinct passage of time, and characters do mature and grow older. So being able to experience that again, I think, will be pleasing for them. And for the new users especially, I think you've seen that Terry has been guest starring in lots of different games. So, being able to play him in those games is great, but to be able to come and play him as an original series, his original IP, I think is something that everybody should try to experience.
I did want to talk about the new characters too, and we've got a chance to play with both of them, both Vox and Pricha. How did you want these new characters to kind of build out the roster and provide their own unique character experiences for players?
Yeah, especially, I mean, one of the goals for this game is to try to get as many new people to play the IP as possible. So making new characters was kind of a must, obviously. But one thing that we did try to do with these two new characters in particular is make sure that some of our younger staff, who also might not know that much about Fatal Fury and such compared to the veterans, had as many opinions as possible, and they really helped guide the direction of these new characters' development.
You all have been working on Fatal Fury, particularly Fatal Fury City of the Wolves, for a very long time. How is it seeing it at events like this and players like that playing loudly and clearly having a good time as they, finally see all the hard work you've done?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously very fun to see people excited, but it's also, there's a sense of relief, because we're still in the middle of development. You really never know how things are going to be received, but, it gives us a lot of sense of relief, and also we just see that, okay, we're doing the right thing. We just have to keep using this time to make the game better and better, and everybody's going to really enjoy it when it does come out.
Fatal Fury has decades of history, and the fighting game community has grown so much since Fatal Fury made its debut over 30 years ago. How do you see the future of Fatal Fury and how it fits within the fighting game community?
In his opinion, it's one of the legendary fighting games, so he wants people to just go in and kind of experience the legend for themselves.
This has been Den of Geek here at Summer Game Fest 2024, playing the new Fatal Fury City of the Wolves, out on PlayStation 5, Xbox Series XS, and PC in early 2025. Gentlemen, thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. After a hard day at work, when I finally come home to game, I have a whole routine that I've set up for myself. I boot up my PC, light a candle, maybe put on some music, see what games my friends online are playing, check my PC performance, and then I'm off to the races. It's a whole ritual that I've created for myself. And after doing it for years, I didn't think that ritual could get any better. But with Razer Cortex and Axon, 100% improves it every time. Here are all the ways Razer Cortex and Axon improve my ritual and hopefully can improve yours too. As you can imagine, I love to build the perfect gaming environment. That can be amiibo, it can be statues, all kinds of merchandise. But after doing that for years, I realized I was limiting myself to the physical environment. So much of gaming being digital, Razer Axon lets you customize and create the perfect wallpapers, backgrounds, and chroma effects that extend to your supported devices. With so much of your gaming optimized, why don't you optimize your environment too with Razer Axon? Speaking of friends playing online, having to boot up and load individual game launchers and sort through all those individual libraries, that can take time. It can feel tedious, it can feel like a hassle. But did you know that Razer Cortex lets you consolidate those game launchers into a single program and lets you organize and customize your library so you can really get to the games that you want and have them look the way you want them to look? With such an investment going into your gaming library, why don't you make it your own through Razer Cortex? What I love the most about Razer Cortex? Well, it lets me get to my games faster and it lets my games run better. Through Game Booster and System Booster in Razer Cortex, it automatically detects, identifies, and cleans up all those unnecessary background programs, all those processes, all those old files. It cleans all that stuff up, so it lets me get to my games faster, lets me play these games better. I mean, with so much time spent in my games, why don't I want them to run the best they can possibly run thanks to Razer Cortex? And that is how Razer Cortex and Axon have improved my gaming ritual. They've become part of my routine seamlessly without any disruption, and they've significantly improved my overall gaming experience. Why don't you download Razer Cortex and Axon for free to see what these programs can do for you?
Thank you to Razer for sponsoring this episode. And now, back to the show.
This year marks the 25th anniversary of the Sega Dreamcast, the final Sega home console before the company decided to focus primarily on software. Of course, it's a console ahead of its time, and here I am with Den of Geek Games Editor Matthew Byrd to talk all about it. Matt, thanks for coming on the show today.
Well, Sam, thanks for having me. Before we get started, though, I do have a bone to pick with you. We're here to talk about the Sega Dreamcast, I believe, and you seem to be wearing a Nintendo shirt.
I sure am, but all my Sega gear is at the dry cleaners right now, and of course I just love playing with power.
Well, first off, that's very insulting. Second of all, I've seen your wardrobe, and there's no way that all of your Sega shirts are at the dry cleaners.
I plead the fifth on that one. Let's just talk about Sega Dreamcast. I mean, and like any good story, let's start at the beginning. The Sega Saturn hadn't really sold that well in North America. It had sold pretty, solid numbers in Japan. Right. And so Sega was like, we need a new console.
Well, I have to share with you a Sega Saturn memory real quick. To your point, my only experience with the Sega Saturn growing up is a cousin, somebody in my family, a cousin, owned a Sega Saturn. Only person I knew who ever owned one. Went over to his house, saw Nights into Dreams one time, thought, that's pretty cool, and then never thought about the Saturn again. I feel like the Saturn was the console your cousin owned, some neighbor owned. Yeah. You saw Nights into Dreams once, and this is the North American experience, to be fair. And then it just was a blip on the radar.
I remember seeing ads for like Nights into Dreams, and I remember I had a friend that kid down the street has a Sega Saturn. Like, oh, cool. What's a Sega Saturn? And like they was like, oh, they have Sonic R. Is it any good?
No, not particularly. They have a worse version of Resident Evil, though, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and a worse version of Symphony of the Night.
But to the Saturn's credit, it was not the console was not great. The full library that was largely available in Japan was pretty strong. But Sega realized at that point, okay, the hardware's a problem. We got to go back to the drawing board.
I mean, and you look at the launch library for the Dreamcast, and it's incredible. And in terms of marketing, to let everybody know when it came out, I know you love to list the date.
9/9/99. I just remember I was old enough it was really the first console I was consciously aware, first major console I was consciously aware was about to be released. For the previous consoles I had played, I was really too young to be fully aware of the anticipation. They just kind of existed. With the Dreamcast, that was the first one where I was like, oh my God, I am so hyped for this console. It's got this great 9/9/99 release date. They had the fantastic It's Thinking campaign. They had these arcade perfect visuals to show everything off with, and I just could not wait. And then I never bought one as a kid. And I think that kind of segues into the issue.
I think so. So that came out while I was in middle school. And, I had recently gotten a Nintendo 64, so my parents weren't champing at the bit to give me another console.
Yeah, we were a PlayStation household.
We were Nintendo.
Hey.
As you can tell. But you look at the launch library, Crazy Taxi,
Soul
Calibur, the original Sonic Adventure. So many. You were talking arcade games, practically arcade perfect, fighting games. The last Fatal Fury game for 25 years comes out on the Dreamcast. Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, the only official U.S. launch of Street Fighter 3 New Generation, all Marvel vs. Capcom 2.
Well, it was a strange thing with the Dreamcast because it was arcade perfect. Maybe not the first, but I would say it's one of the first console-wide arcade perfect experiences, which for a long time had been the benchmark in video game visuals to be arcade perfect, right? But it was a weird thing because it felt like, okay, it cleared that benchmark, but it was already at that point starting to feel like an outdated benchmark, even though it was the first console to properly do it on quite the scale it did. But that was a weird thing where, okay, it's clearing this previous benchmark we held all the video game consoles to, but also the Dreamcast is really moving the industry forward in other interesting ways.
It's a console, and we said this at the top, and it's true. It truly is a console ahead of its time.
Yeah.
The built-in modem, it's one of the few consoles with 4 built-in controller ports, how ergonomic the controller is. And if we're going to talk about the controller,
are you a fan of the Dreamcast controller? Because it is divisive.
I actually like it. People complain about, the Duke, which was the original launch Xbox
yes,
controller.
I was a proud Duke owner, yes.
Yeah. Dreamcast is a similar design, and it's much more intuitive. You've got the trigger-shaped shoulder buttons, which it predates the original Xbox by 2 years. If we're going to talk about the controller, we got to talk about the video memory unit.
Yes.
Yeah, the VMU. You would get a specific branded game for whatever you were playing as you were playing it if you had this plugged in, and it was basically your memory card. And it would just fit in right straight into the controller. It's for me, that's the one novelty where it's
maybe
Well, it was the Tamagotchi era, right?
Yes,
So
true.
they were like, oh my God, so you not only get a memory card, a built-in memory card, you get this little handheld game. I would struggle to remember some of the games that properly supported the VMU as a standalone device. I believe Shenmue did. I think Sonic Adventure had the launch games had like a mini tie-in kind of experience.
It was like a chow. You would have like the chows from the Sonic Adventure games would show up on there, and you'd be like, oh, these are cute and probably designed specifically for this.
Of its time, to be fair, but also thinking ahead, in terms of kind of using every part of the buffalo when it comes to the console hardware. But the thing with the Sega Saturn was like dead on arrival. When it went against the PlayStation, it was like, okay, well, it pretty much lost the war right away. When you look at the Sega Dreamcast, though, you're like, oh my God, this has to be the future, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I think the thing that kills the Saturn, in addition to having 20 to 25% of the total library released in America, it also launched $100 more than the PS1. I mean, there's a great E3 moment where the Sony of America representative just says the sales price, the launch price for the PS1, and walks off stage after the Sega presentation.
$299.
I think they were cognizant of that. Dreamcast comes out almost a full year ahead of the PS2 in Japan. But I mean, the other flip side of it, the Sega Dreamcast is the greatest console that you don't own. It's or maybe did you ever get a Dreamcast after the fact?
I dreamed of getting one when it launched, and I never did. It was always the console I wanted to get after the fact, where I made a little money for myself, in the market, railroads, oils, boiled denim, whatever it may have been. No, I never went back and got one. I've played a lot of Dreamcast games through, somebody else's console or just after the fact on our devices, and we'll get to in a little bit. Fell in love with the library, as a lot of people did. But no, I never owned the console, and it really is a thing because I almost feel like I'm part of the problem to a degree of that person who saw the Dreamcast and was like, oh my God, and then never pulled the trigger.
No, I mean, growing up in a Nintendo household, I was still playing the N64 pretty religiously. I knew the GameCube was coming, approximately 2 years later. It was a Project Reality or Project Dolphin is what it was at the time. It was like, oh, Project Dolphin. Nintendo was working on Project Dolphin. So I never got it at launch. I would always have to go to a friend's house. My most salient memories of Dreamcast in those days, when it was like a contemporary console, was like Sonic Adventure getting chased by the killer whale. Resident Evil Code Veronica was originally a Dreamcast exclusive, and I'm a huge Resident Evil fan. And Shenmue, and I was just like, oh, this is really cool. This, it's basically evolved into what Yakuza and Like a Dragon became. But I mean, with Dreamcast, those were my most salient memories. Didn't buy one until well after college and all that.
It's the strange thing when you're talking about the Dreamcast, because Shenmue, what a perfect example of a game ahead of its time, where it's such a one-to-one with what Yakuza Like a Dragon became. And even if you look at the broader open world genre, so many more now draw from things we saw in Shenmue, but Shenmue was not of its time. Not really. It was fair, it did okay. It got some good reviews. It did some, but when you just look to when you look at the resources that went into it.
Most expensive video game of its time.
The hype around it. Yeah. And then it comes out and it's not quite, the market isn't ready for them yet. But I feel like you can't talk about the Dreamcast being ahead of its time without talking about its online play, which is the thing that blew my mind about the console back then. Even though I lived in an area where the internet was so poor, I would have never been able to take advantage of it. It was the thing about the device I could not believe.
I mean, the idea that you could play other people online, PC gaming had done it earlier with Doom and doing deathmatch on Doom, but the idea you could do it on a console and play Unreal Tournament or Ultima Online or any of that sort of stuff, Phantasy Star, it was wild, and it was built in.
Out of the box, $19.99, simple 56K hookup. Yeah. And not only that, but I would say unlike Xbox even when it launched, there were multiple games as soon as the Dreamcast was available that supported online functionality and did it reasonably well. NFL 2K1, I was a big Choo Choo Rocket fan. I've since kind of come back to that. Yeah. There were multiple games where it's okay, this isn't just a gimmick. This is something you're going to be able to do right now. And I think that's the aspect of it where it's okay, that was ahead of its time thinking in terms of the implementation. But it should have also been of its time. It feels like that should have been something that was more exciting to people. But then I think in my situation where it's I was in a rural area, I did not have great internet. I couldn't have really taken advantage of that even if I wanted to. It's when you start to look at it from that market perspective, where people are really at that point in their lives, that you kind of start to piece together why the Dreamcast did not do that well.
No, and even as cool as having a built-in modem, which the PS2 didn't have, by the way, you had to get an add-on.
Yeah. Oh, it was way behind.
Yeah. I was still using dial-up internet. It's not like, I don't think my parents would have been like, hey, I need to make a phone call or check my email. And I'm just being like, well, I'm playing Unreal 2K4 right now, or just Unreal Tournament right now. I need this.
Yeah.
It was literally ahead of its time in that regard.
It was, which is a shame, though, when you talk about it, because it's a compliment to a degree, but it's also like, okay, there's some practicality problems here, right? But I will say this. I think if you put all the ways ahead of time, all the things that didn't quite work at that time, the reason people loved the Dreamcast, beyond the ideas it represented, was the games it gave them. Incredible library for a very short lifespan.
Yeah, I mean, it's launched, you were mentioning the 2K games. Those were produced by Sega. We had touched on, there's 2 Sonic Adventures games. There's Crazy Taxi. That was a huge one for Dreamcast. Resident Evil. All the fighting games. Soul Calibur starts there, and you've got all these Street Fighters, and Fatal Fury ends there for decades. It really is like, that's a robust library. I mean, there's as somebody that collects Dreamcast games, I've only scratched the surface, and I've had a Dreamcast for over a year, or however long, and I've regularly buy games.
Well, we've referenced the Sega Saturn. I don't know if you knew this, but the Sega Saturn somehow outsold the Sega Dreamcast, which feels wild to me when you look at the two devices, you look at their libraries. Sega Dreamcast just feels superior in every conceivable major way in retrospect. But that's the curse of the Dreamcast, is it's always going to be a console we look back at in retrospect.
Yeah.
In hindsight, it looks fantastic. At the time, you wish you could almost go back and, it's the ultimate what if in gaming history.
We have to touch on what killed it, right? I mean, how bad did the PS2 kill any and all momentum that the Dreamcast had when the PS2 launched in 2000?
A console doesn't fail that hard without there being multiple factors for its death, but yes, you can look at the PS2, the hype of the PS2, what Sony had did with the PlayStation beforehand, the appeal of that DVD player to, it's like, didn't have the best launch library, didn't really offer online play, not a ton of bells and whistles really if you break it down, besides the DVD player.
Yeah.
But, and I think this is the point, with the PlayStation, Sony established themselves. They got people excited. They're like, hey, you love the PlayStation? Here's the PlayStation 2. The Dreamcast followed the Saturn, which followed the Genesis, which came with the 32X, Sega CD, and it was an association of failure, or shortcomings, if not outright failure at that point.
Yeah, I mean, you also have to keep in mind, this might be lost on audiences today, DVD players in 2000 were expensive.
Oh my God.
Where it's oh, well, I'll just get a PS2, which my family did, and it's just and it can play DVDs as well. Awesome.
Sam, I will remember getting a PS2 in 2000. We were lucky enough to get one that holiday season. My cousin squirreled one away at Toys R Us so we could come pick one up.
Yeah.
I remember going to the local library to rent our first DVD, which I believe was gone in 60 seconds, I want to say.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and it's just our minds being blown the first time we saw a DVD menu or skipping chapters and all that. Now, of course, the PlayStation 2 is much more into DVD player, and it might be the greatest console of all time on its own terms. It's a conversation for another day. Yeah. But yes, that initial experience where it's the PlayStation 2 immediately fit into every living room, whereas the Dreamcast was kind of an anomaly in a lot of houses.
It was a CD player.
It was, yes. It was a CD player. You could go online, maybe.
Yeah.
You could play a few. It's a shame. It really is. Yeah. But I'll tell you, it's a great console to look back at and love. It's so easy to love in retrospect. Yeah. But it's kind of like what happened with John Carpenter in The Thing, where whenever he has to talk about The Thing now, and people are like, oh, well, The Thing is an incredible cult hit now, and everyone loves it. And he's kind of like, it'd been nice if more people saw it back in the day. Bought a few more tickets back then.
Yeah, where were you guys in the 80s?
Yes.
Just like with the Dreamcast. I mean, I say this as a Dreamcast owner now, every time I sit down and play it, I'm like, this is really fun.
It's amazing.
It's so much, and here we are 25 years later, and I think that, it's been reappraised in that time. We're certainly reappraising it now, and, we want to make sure that we give it all the possible compliments, write that love letter to Sega for ending on a note that almost killed them, but ending on a high note,
Yeah, it's the weirdest thing. One of the best consoles they ever made was the last major console they ever made. But, I think if you're ahead of your time, you eventually coming around to being of your time. And right now, I think in 2024, Sega Dreamcast is an incredible console.
Absolutely. Well, do you have any final thoughts before we, lay the Dreamcast to rest?
Don't say it like that. It lives eternally in our hearts.
Of course, yeah. Well, Matt, thanks for coming on the show today and talking all about the Sega Dreamcast.
Sam, thanks for having me. It's a console that doesn't get talked about enough.
Absolutely, one day you'll be remembered among the greats. And of course, thank you to SNK for letting us try out the new Fatal Fury and speaking with us about the game. Thank you to Razer for helping make this episode possible. I'm Sam. This is Power Up. We'll see you guys next time.